South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa and World Health Organization Chief Tedros Ghebreyesus have lashed out at vaccine nationalism as the gap for COVID-19 vaccine supplies between rich and poor countries widens. Africa is experiencing an aggressive second wave of the virus, recording some 32,000 new cases every day. Now, while other countries have long begun vaccinating their populations, only a small number of countries in Africa have actually begun administering vaccines. Now, in a moment, I'll be talking to the UN Deputy Secretary General. But first, here is Cyril Ramaphosa, who, as the current chair of the African Union, has been leading efforts to secure sufficient vaccine doses for Africa's 1.3 billion people. He's accused rich countries of hoarding vaccines, making them inaccessible to poorer nations.
And some countries have even gone beyond and acquired up to 4 times what their population needs. And that was aimed at hoarding these vaccines. And now this is being done to the exclusion of countries, of other countries in the world that most need this.
And I'm pleased to welcome to the program the UN's Deputy Secretary General, Amina J. Mohammed. Welcome to DW News Africa. Africa is trailing behind when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. Basically, only a handful of people have been vaccinated in sub-Saharan Africa as we speak. Today, we heard from the WHO's envoy to Africa. He said that the continent cannot count on having doses of vaccines soon. Now, this is happening as the continent is facing a very aggressive second wave of the pandemic. What is your message to wealthier countries who are said to be buying up all the vaccine stock, engaging in what some are calling vaccine nationalism?
Well, thank you very much for having me. Well, I think the message has been very clear from the Secretary General all along that when we come to the vaccine, that it's got to be the people's vaccine. It's got to be available to everyone, everywhere. Otherwise, we're not going to see the end to COVID. We're not going to see the end to the shutdowns in our economies. And we all know that COVID health pandemic is much more than a health crisis, it's a socioeconomic one. Currently, the COVAX facility, which is part of the ACT Accelerator, has been signed on to by many countries. It's co-chaired by the President of South Africa, but it hasn't yielded the results that we expect. And it certainly hasn't been able to provide vaccines, at least for the frontline workers, across the world.
So what is to be done?
Well,
you're saying it yourself that the initiative hasn't been as effective. People are dying in huge numbers, growing numbers. The second wave has been aggressive. What is to be done?
Well, the first is to make the resources available and for surpluses to be shared immediately for frontline workers around the world in vulnerable countries. The second is to realize that the production of the vaccine is not sufficient. And so even if you had the money today, you would not be able to get the vaccines. And that is to now look to those places of production to get the quality assurance and to get production ratcheted up so that we can get these vaccines out to everyone.
From where things stand, what is a realistic picture as to when people in Africa will be vaccinated? Some countries are announcing that vaccinations, you mentioned South Africa, due to start in February, for example. But what is the real picture from the information that you're getting from organizations like the WHO, just in terms of when we can get a reasonable amount of the population in Africa vaccinated?
Well, I think like the rest of the world is not going to see much before the second half of this year. We will begin to start vaccinating, and hopefully our frontline workers, our health workers, will be the first, and we'll see that coming in April. The efforts that have been made by the African Union envoy are considerable with the support of a number of heads of state and government in Africa. So I would say the second half of the year we will begin to see it, but it will go into next year before we say the cohort that we require to be vaccinated would be. It's not just about the vaccinations. It's important that we look at all other aspects of making sure that we are safe, we are masked, and that the health systems that we have are reinforced with investments that are needed right now in these stimulus packages to help us cope with the uptake in people getting into the hospitals with COVID.
Right. I do want to pivot to climate change now, because that's something that you have been addressing the World Economic Forum about. I know you spoke today on that. You know, we were always being reminded that, you know, Africa contributes the least when it comes to CO2 emissions. But the reality on the ground is that millions of people on the continent are being forced to flee from their homes because of severe weather pattern changes, storms, droughts, displacing people in huge numbers. We're talking solutions now. It's one thing to be signed up to global pacts that, by the way, many people say aren't as effective enough anyway, even in their ambitious targets. I'm sitting in Germany, and the parliament here has debated the idea of giving asylum and refugee status, really, to people fleeing the effects and the adverse effects of climate change from their countries. What do you make of a proposal like that? And would you like to see perhaps countries in the developed world, who many attribute the blame for where we are in terms of the climate crisis, to be taking such solid and concrete action?
I think it's very welcoming to see that Germany is doing that, and that's what many other countries have done. Many have signed up to taking on climate refugees. But what is more important is that we need the investments to make our societies and countries in Africa much more resilient and able to deal with adaptation and the climate change that is happening, which you rightly say is of no fault of Africa. Less than 2%, I think, of emissions coming out of Africa. Africa needs to grow. There's an opportunity for Africa to leapfrog. COVID is not an excuse. It is an opportunity for investments that come into green transitions. What does that mean? Our stimulus packages, there are fiscal gaps that need to be attended to. There needs to be a global response. The G20 needs to take responsibility and make that happen. The private sector needs to come in. And we need to see that energy transitions that will create greener jobs are happening in our countries, that food systems are becoming much more adaptable to what we're seeing in climate change, and that we're investing in the skills and reducing, closing the digital gap so that we can have our young people, for which we have the largest cohort ever, up front and center in the investments that we make.
Finally, Ms. Mohammed, I want to get your thoughts on what some are calling the shrinking democratic space in Africa. Elections are not fully free and fair. Rights groups describe clear patterns of government violent and deadly repression against peaceful protests and general dissent. Governments shut down the internet when it's convenient for them. Young people in Africa feel let down by their leaders and that they have no recourse. What is your message to leaders in Africa who are undermining democracy in their countries?
I think it's very important for leaders to remember that social contract between themselves and the people. And it is really shaky right now, and it is at risk. And we cannot afford that if we intend to deepen democracy and to have young people believe in those values. And so I think a lot of responsibility for leaders to take up and to demonstrate and to work at bringing back that social contract and including young people, including the voice of people and their aspirations and their rights. And one of the ways to show that is, of course, our elections, and they should be free, they should be fair. You should be free from fear that you go to put your vote, and we have to work on that.
But that's not the reality, Deputy Secretary General. That's not the reality, and it appears.
Of course, it's not the reality, Christine. This world is about a reality and the aspirations, and there is a gap, and every day we work to close that gap. So what happens this year, we want to make sure it doesn't happen next year and the year after until we have free and peaceful elections all over the world. We don't give up on it. We acknowledge it, we put a spotlight on it, and we try to do better. And we speak to leaders about their responsibility to ensure that elections free, fair, and certainly free of violence.
All right, that is the UN's Deputy Secretary General, Amina J. Mohammed. Thank you for your time, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Christine.